Hello, my darling, and welcome to Chapter 2, The Tale of Inspector Legras. The older matters which had made the sculptor's dream so significant to my uncle formed the subject of the second half of his long manuscript. Once before, it appears, Professor Engel had seen the hellish outlines of the nameless monstrosity, puzzled over the unknown hieroglyphics, and heard the ominous syllables which can be rendered only as Cthulhu. And all this in so stirring and horrible a connection that it is a small wonder he pursued young Wilcox with queries and demands for data. The earlier experience had come in 1908, 17 years before, when the American Archaeological Society held its annual meeting in St. Louis. Professor Engel, as befitted one of his authority and attainments, had a prominent part in all of the deliberations, and was one of the first to be approached by the several outsiders who took advantage of the convocation. They offered questions for correct answering and problems for expert solutions. The chief of these outsiders, and in a short time the focus of interest for the entire meeting, was a commonplace-looking middle-aged man who had traveled all the way from New Orleans for certain special information unobtainable from any local source. His name was John Raymond Legras. He was by profession an inspector of police. With him he bore the subject of his visit, a grotesque, repulsive, and apparently very ancient stone statuette, the origin of which he was at a loss to determine. It must not be fancied that Inspector Legras had the least interest in archaeology. On the contrary, his wish for enlightenment was prompted by purely professional considerations. The statuette, idol, fetish, or whatever it was, had been captured some months before in the wooded swamps south of New Orleans during a raid on a supposed voodoo meeting. And so singular and hideous were the rites connected with it that the police could not but realize that they had stumbled upon a dark cult totally unknown to them. This cult was infinitely more diabolic than even the blackest of the African voodoo circles. Of its origin, apart from the erratic and unbelievable tales extorted from the captured members, absolutely nothing was to be discovered. Hence the anxiety of the police for any antiquarian lore which might help them to place this frightful symbol. All they wanted was to track it down and find the cult to its fountainhead. Inspector Legras was scarcely prepared for the sensation which his offering created. One sight of the thing had been enough to throw the assembled men of science into a state of tense excitement, and they lost no time in crowding around him to gaze at the diminutive figure whose utter strangeness and air of genuinely abysmal antiquity hinted so potently at unopened and archaic vistas. No recognized school of sculpture had animated this terrible object, and yet centuries and even thousands of years seemed recorded in its dim and greenish surface of unplaceable stone. The figure which was finally passed slowly from man to man for close and careful study, was between 7 and 8 inches in height and of exquisitely artistic workmanship. It represented a monster of vaguely anthropoid outline, but with an octopus-like head, whose face was a mass of feelers, a scaly, rubbery-looking body, prodigious claws on hind and fore feet, and long, narrow wings behind. This thing, which seemed instinct with a fearsome and unnatural malignancy, was of a somewhat bloated corpulence, and squatted evilly on a rectangular block or pedestal covered with undecipherable characters. The tips of the wings touched the black edge of the block. The seat occupied the center, while the long curved claws of the doubled up, crouching hind legs gripped the front edge and extended a quarter of the way down toward the bottom of the pedestal. The cephalopod head was bent forward so that the ends of the facial feelers brushed the backs of huge forepaws. The forepaws clasped the croucher's elevated knees. The aspect of the whole was abnormally lifelike, and the more subtly fearful because its source was so totally unknown. Its vast, awesome, and incalculable age was unmistakable, yet not one link did it show with any known type of art belonging to civilization's youth, or indeed to any other time. Totally separate and apart. Its very material was a mystery, for the soapy, greenish-black stone with its golden, iridescent flecks had striations resembling nothing familiar to geology or mineralogy. The characters along the base were equally baffling. Not one man present, despite a representation of half the world's experts. No one could form the least notion of even their remotest linguistic kinship. They, like the subject and material, belong to something horribly remote, distinct from mankind as we know it, something frightfully suggestive of old and unhallowed cycles of life. Our world and our conceptions have no part of this. And yet, as the members shook their heads and confessed defeat at the inspector's problem, there was one man in the gathering who suspected a touch of bizarre familiarity in the monstrous shape and writing, and who presently told with some diffidence of the odd trifle he knew. This person was the late William Channing Webb, professor of anthropology at Princeton University, explorer of no slight note. Professor Webb had been engaged 48 years before in a tour of Greenland and Iceland in search of some runic inscriptions which he failed to unearth. And whilst high up in the West Greenland coast, he encountered a singular tribe, a cult, more accurately, of degenerate Esquimaux whose religion, a curious form of devil worship, chilled him with its deliberate bloodthirstiness and repulsiveness. It was a faith of which other Esquimaux knew little, and which they mentioned only with shudders, saying that it had come from horribly ancient aeons before the world was made. Besides nameless rites and human sacrifices, there were certain strange hereditary rituals addressed to a supreme elder devil, a Tornasuk, and of this Professor Webb had taken a careful phonetic copy from an old, aged Angakok, or wizard priest, expressing the sounds in Roman letters as best he knew how. But now, of prime significance, was the fetish which this cult had cherished, and around which they danced when the aurora leapt high over the ice cliffs. It was, the professor stated, a very crude statuette of stone, comprising a hideous picture and some very cryptic writing. And so far as he could tell, it was a rough parallel in all essential features. It was a bestial thing, and it lay there questionable before this meeting. This data, received with suspense and astonishment by the assembled members, proved doubly exciting to Inspector Legras. He began at once to ply his informant with questions. Having noted and copied an old oral ritual among the swamp cult worshippers, which his men had arrested, he besought the professor to remember as best he might the syllables taken down amongst the diabolist Esquimaux. There then followed an exhaustive comparison of details, and a moment of really odd silence when both detective and scientist agreed on the virtual identity of the phrase common to two hellish rituals so many worlds of distance apart. What, in substance, both the wizards and the Louisiana swamp priests had chanted to their kindred idols was something very strange. The word divisions being guessed at from traditional breaks in the phrase, chanted aloud. Many words with many consonants, and all he could make out in the center was the word Cthulhu, Rylea, Waga. Legras had one point in advance of Professor Webb, for several among his mongrel prisoners had repeated to him what older celebrants had told him the words meant. This text, as given, ran something like this. In this house, Rylea, dead Cthulhu waits, dreaming. And now, in response to a general and urgent demand, Inspector Legras related as fully as possible his experience with the swamp worshippers. He told a story to which I could see my uncle attached profound significance. It savored of the wildest dreams of mythmaker and theosophist, and disclosed an astonishing degree of cosmic imagination. It was among such half-castes and pariahs as might be at least expected to possess it. On November 1st, 1907, there had come to the New Orleans police a frantic summons from the swamp, and also from the lagoon country to the south. The squatters there, mostly primitive but good-natured descendants, were in the grip of stark terror from an unknown thing which had stolen upon them in the night. It was voodoo, apparently, but voodoo of a more terrible sort than they had ever known. Further, some of their women and children had disappeared since the malevolent tom-tom had begun its incessant beating far within the black haunted hills, where no dweller ventured. There were insane shouts and harrowing screams, soul-chilling chants and dancing devil flames, and the frightened messenger added, the people could stand this no more. So a body of 20 police, filling 2 carriages and an automobile, had set out in the late afternoon with the shivering squatter as their guide. At the end of the passable road they alighted, and for miles splashed on in silence through the terrible cypress woods where day never came. Ugly roots and malignant hanging nooses of Spanish moss beset them, and now and then a pile of dank stones or fragment of a rotting wall, intensified by its hint of morbid habitation, a depression which every malformed tree and every fungus islet combined to create. At length the squatter's settlement, a miserable huddle of huts, hove in sight, and hysterical dwellers ran out to a cluster around the group of bobbing lanterns. The muffled beat of tom-toms was now faintly audible, far, far ahead. A curdling shriek came at infrequent intervals when the wind shifted. A reddish glare, too, seemed to filter through the pale undergrowth beyond endless avenues of forest night. Reluctant even to be left alone again, each one of the cowed squatters refused point blank to advance any further toward the scene of unholy worship. So Inspector Legrasse and his 19 colleagues plunged on, unguided into black arcades of horror that none of them had ever trod before. The region now entered by the police was one of traditionally evil repute, substantially unknown and untraversed by white men. There were legends of a hidden lake unglimpsed by mortal sight, in which dwelt a huge, formless, white, polypus thing with luminous eyes. Squatters whispered that bat-winged devils flew out of caverns in inner earth to worship it at midnight. They said it had been there before d'Iberville, before La Salle, before the Indians, and before even the wholesome beasts and birds of the woods. It was a nightmare itself, and to see it meant you would die. But it made men dream, and so they knew enough to keep away. The present voodoo orgy was, indeed, on the merest fringe of this abhorred area, but that location was bad enough. Hence, perhaps, the very place of the worship had terrified the squatters more than the shocking sounds and incidents. Only poetry or madness could do justice to the noises heard by Legrasse's men. They plowed on through the black morass toward the red glare and the muffled tom-toms. There are vocal qualities peculiar to men, and vocal qualities peculiar to beasts, and it is terrible to hear the one when the source should yield the other. Animal fury and orgiastic license here whip themselves to demonic heights by howls, squawking ecstasies. All of these tore and reverberated through those nighted woods, like pestilential tempests from the gulfs of hell. Now and then the less organized ululation would cease, and from what seemed a well-drilled chorus, of hoarse voices would rise in sing-song chant a hideous phrase that he had heard before. Cthulhu Rylea Waga Nago. Then the men, having reached a spot where the trees were thinner, came suddenly in sight of the spectacle itself. 4 of them reeled, 1 fainted, and 2 were shaken into a frantic cry, which the mad cacophony of the orgy fortunately deadened. Legrasse dashed swamp water on the face of the fainting men, and all stood trembling and nearly hypnotized with horror. In a natural glade of the swamp stood a grassy island. It was perhaps an acre's extent, clear of trees and tolerably dry. On this now leaped and twisted a more indescribable horde, a human abnormality. Void of clothing, this hybrid spawn were braying, bellowing, writhing about a monstrous ring-shaped bonfire, in the center of which, revealed by occasional rifts in the curtain of flame, stood a great granite monolith some 8 feet in height. Incongruous with its diminutiveness rested the noxious carven statuette. From a wide circle of 10 scaffolds set up at regular intervals, flame-girt monolith as a creature hung. Head downward, the oddly marred bodies of the helpless squatters who had disappeared were here. It was inside the circle that the ring of worshippers jumped and roared. The general direction of the mass motion was left to right. It was an endless bacchanal between the ring of bodies and the ring of fire. It may have been only imagination, and it may have been only echoes. One of the men was induced. He was an excitable Spaniard. He fancied he heard antiphonal responses to the ritual, as though from some far, an unilluminated spot deeper within the wood of an ancient legendary horror. This man, Joseph D. Galvez, I later met and questioned, and he proved distractingly imaginative. He indeed went so far as to hint of the faint beating of great wings, and of a glimpse of shining eyes, and a mountainous white bulk beyond the remotest trees. But I suppose he had been hearing too much native superstition. Actually, the horrified pause of the men was of comparatively brief duration. Duty came first, and although there must have been nearly 100 mongrel celebrants in the throng, the police relied on their firearms, and they plunged determinedly into the nauseous rout. For 5 minutes, the resultant din and chaos were beyond description. Wild blows were struck, shots were fired, and escapes were made. But in the end, Legrasse was able to count 47 sullen prisoners. He forced these to dress in haste and fall into line between 2 rows of policemen. 5 worshippers lay dead, and 2 severely wounded ones were carried away on improvised stretchers by their fellow prisoners. Examined at headquarters after a trip of intense strain and weariness, the prisoners all proved to be men of very low, mixed blood with mental aberrancy. Most were seamen, and a sprinkling of black men, largely West Indians, Brava Portuguese, some from the Cape Verde Islands. They gave a coloring of voodooism to the heterogeneous cult. But before many questions were asked, it became manifest that something far deeper and older was involved. Degraded and ignorant as they were, the creatures held with surprising consistency to the central idea of their loathsome faith. They worshipped, so they said, the great old ones who lived ages before even men existed. And these great old ones came to the young world from the sky. The old ones were gone now, inside the earth and under the sea, but their dead bodies had told their secrets in dreams to the first men, and these first men formed a cult which had never died. This was that cult, and the prisoners said it had always existed and always would exist, hidden in distant wastes and dark places all over the world until the time when the great priest Cthulhu, from his dark house in the mighty city of Relea, under the waters, should rise and bring the earth again beneath his sway. Someday he would call when the stars were ready, and the secret cult would always be there to liberate him. Meanwhile, no more must be told. There was a secret which even torture could not extract. Mankind was not absolutely alone among the conscious things of earth. Shapes came out of the dark to visit the faithful few. But these were not the great old ones. No man now had ever seen the old ones. The carven idol was the great Cthulhu. But no one would say whether or not the others were precisely like him. No one could read the old writing now, but things were told by word of mouth. The chanted ritual was not the secret. That was never spoken aloud, only whispered. The chant meant only this: in his house, dead Cthulhu waits, dreaming. Only 2 of the prisoners were found sane enough to be hanged. The rest were committed to various institutions, all denied a part in the ritual murders, and all said that the killing had been done by black-winged ones. These ones had come to them from their immemorial meeting place in the haunted wood, but of those mysterious allies, no coherent account could ever be gained. What the police did extract came mainly from an immensely aged mestizo named Castro. Castro claimed to have sailed to strange ports and talked with undying leaders of the cult in the mountains of China. Old Castro remembered bits of hideous legend which paled the speculations of theosophists, and they made man and the world seem recent and transient indeed. There had been aeons where other things ruled the earth, and these other things had great cities. Remains of them, he said, the deathless Chinaman had told him, were still to be found as cyclopean stones on islands in the Pacific. They all died vast epochs of time before men came. But there are arts which could revive them when the stars had come around again to the right positions in the cycles of eternity. They had indeed come themselves from the stars and brought their images with them. Those great old ones, Castro continued, were not composed altogether of flesh and blood. They had shape. For did not this star-fashioned image prove it? But that shape was not made of matter. When the stars were right, they could plunge from world to world through the sky. But when the stars were wrong, they could not live. But although they no longer lived, they would never really die. They all lay in stone houses in the great city of Rylea, preserved by the spells of mighty Cthulhu, for a glorious resurrection when the stars and the earth might once more be ready for them. But at that time some force from outside must serve to liberate their bodies. The spells that preserved them intact likewise prevented them from making an initial move. They could only lie awake in the dark and think, whilst uncounted millions of years rolled by. They knew all that was occurring in the universe, but their mode of speech was transmitted through thought. Even now they talked in their tombs, when, after infinities of chaos, the first men came. The great old one spoke to the sensitive among them. They molded their dreams, for only thus could their language reach the fleshly minds of mammals. Then, whispered Castro, those first men formed the cult around the small idols which the Great One showed them. Idols brought in dim areas from dark stars. That cult would never die until the stars came right again, and the secret priest would take great Cthulhu from his tomb and would revive his subjects and resume his role on earth. The time would be easy to know, for then mankind would have become as the great old ones, free and wild, beyond good and evil. Laws and morals would be thrown aside, and all men shouting and killing and reveling in joy. Then the liberated old ones would teach them new ways to shout and kill and revel and enjoy themselves. And all the earth would flame with a holocaust of ecstasy and freedom. Meanwhile, the cult, by appropriate rites, must keep alive the memory of those ancient ways. They must shadow forth the prophecy of their return. In the elder time, chosen men had talked with the entombed old ones in dreams. But then something had happened. In the great stone city Rylea, with its monoliths and sepulchres, had sunk beneath the waves. The deep waters, full of one primal mystery, through which not even thought can pass, had cut off the spectral intercourse. But memory never died, and high priests said that the city would rise again when the stars were right. Then came out of the earth the black spirits of earth, moldy, shadowy, full of dim rumors picked up in caverns beneath forgotten sea bottoms. But of them, old Castro dared not speak much. He cut himself off hurriedly, and no amount of persuasion or subtlety could elicit more in this direction. The size of the old ones, too, he curiously declined to mention. Of the cult, he said he thought the center lay amid the pathless deserts of Arabia, where Arem, the city of pillars, dreams hidden and untouched. It was not allied to the European witch cult, and was virtually unknown beyond its members. No book had ever hinted of it, although the deathless Chinaman said that there were double meanings in the Necronomicon of the mad Arab Abdul al-Harad. This the initiated might read as they chose, especially the much-discussed couplet, "That is not dead, which can eternal lie, and with strange eons even death may die." Legras, deeply impressed and not a little bewildered, had inquired in vain concerning the historic affiliations of the cult. Castro apparently had told the truth when he said that it was wholly secret. The authorities at Tulane University could shed no light upon either cult or image, and now the detective had come to the highest authorities in the country, and he met no more than the Greenland tale of Professor Webb. The feverish interest aroused at the meeting by Legras's tale, corroborated as it was by the statuette, is echoed in the subsequent correspondence of those who attended. Although scant mention occurs in the formal publications of the society, caution is the first care of those accustomed to face occasional charlatanry and imposture. Legras, for some time, lent the image to Professor Webb, but at the latter's death it was returned to him and remains in his possession, where I viewed it not long ago. It is a truly terrible thing, and unmistakably akin to the dream sculpture of young Wilcox. That my uncle was excited by the tale of the sculpture I did not wonder, for what thoughts must arise upon hearing, after a knowledge of what Legras had learned of this cult, of a young, sensitive man who had dreamed not only the figure and exact hieroglyphics of the swamp-found image, also that the Greenland devil tablet, but had come in his dreams upon at least 3 of the precise words of the formula. It was uttered alike by diabolists and mongrel Louisians. Professor Engel's instant start on an investigation of the utmost thoroughness was eminently natural, although privately I suspected young Wilcox of having heard of the cult in some indirect way, and of having invented a series of dreams to heighten and continue the mystery at my uncle's expense. The dream narratives and cuttings collected by the professor were, of course, strong corroboration, but the rationalism of my mind and the extravagance of the whole subject led me to adopt what I thought the most sensible conclusion. So, after thoroughly studying the manuscript again and correlating the theosophical and anthropological notes with the cult narrative of Legras, I made a trip to Providence to see the sculptor, and also to give him the rebuke I thought proper for so boldly imposing upon a learned and aged man. Wilcox still lived alone in the Fleur-de-Lis building on Thomas Street, a hideous Victorian imitation of 17th century Brighton architecture. It flaunted its stuccoed front amidst the lovely colonial houses on the ancient hill, and under the very shadow of the finest Georgian steeple in America. I found him at work in his rooms, and at once conceded from the specimens scattered about that his genius is indeed profound and authentic. He will, I believe, sometime be heard as one of the great decadents, for he has crystallized in clay and will one day mirror in marble those nightmares and fantasies which Arthur Machen evokes in prose, and Clark Ashton Smith makes visible in verse and painting. Dark, frail, and somewhat unkempt in aspect, he turned languidly at my knock. He asked me my business without even rising. When I told him who I was, he displayed some interest. I believe this is because my uncle had excited his curiosity in probing these strange dreams. Yet he had never explained the reason for the study. I did not enlarge his knowledge in this regard, but sought with some subtlety to draw him out. In a short time, I became convinced of his absolute sincerity. He spoke of the dreams in a manner no one could mistake. They and their subconscious residuum had influenced his art profoundly, and he showed me a morbid statue whose contours almost made me shake. It was potent with black suggestion. He could not recall having seen the original of this thing, except in his own dream, but the outlines had formed themselves insensibly under his hands. It was, no doubt, the giant shape he had raved of in delirium. That he really knew nothing of the hidden cult, save from my uncle's relentless catechism had let fall, he soon made clear, and again I strove to think of some way in which he could possibly have received these weird impressions. He talked of his dreams in a strangely poetic fashion. He made me see with terrible vividness the damp cyclopean city of slimy green stone. Its geometry, he oddly said, was all wrong. And here with frightened expectancy the ceaseless, half-mental calling from underground, unintelligible, except for the words, Cthulhu, Cthulhu. These words had formed part of that dread ritual which told of dead Cthulhu's dream vigil in his stone vault at Rylea, and I felt deeply moved despite my rational beliefs. Wilcox, I was sure, had heard of the cult in some casual way, and had soon forgotten it amidst the mass of his equally weird reading and imagining. Later, by virtue of its sheer impressiveness, it had found subconscious expression in dreams, in the sculpture, and in the terrible statue I now beheld, so that his imposture upon my uncle must have been a very innocent one. The youth was of a type, at once slightly affected and slightly ill-mannered, which I could never like, but I was willing enough now to admit both his genius and his honesty. I took leave of him amicably and wished him all the success his talent promises. The matter of the cult still remained to fascinate me, and at times I had visions of personal fame from researchers into its origin and connections. I visited New Orleans, talked with Legras and others of that old-time raiding party, saw the frightful image, and I even questioned some of the mongrel prisoners who still survived. Old Castro, unfortunately, had been dead for some years. What I now heard so graphically at first hand, though it was really no more than a detailed confirmation of what my uncle had written, excited me afresh, for I felt sure that I was on the track of a very real, very secret, and very ancient religion, the discovery of which would make me an anthropologist of note. My attitude was still one of absolute materialism, as I wish it still were, and I discounted, with almost inexplicable perversity, the coincidence of the dream notes and odd cuttings collected by Professor Engel. One thing I began to suspect, and which I now fear, is that my uncle's death was far from natural. He fell on a narrow hill street leading up from an ancient waterfront. It was swarming with foreign mongrels after a careless push from a black sailor. I did not forget the mixed blood and marine pursuits of the cult members in Louisiana, and I would not be surprised to learn of secret methods, poison needles, anything as ruthless and as anciently known as the cryptic rites and beliefs. Legras and his men, it is true, have been let alone, but in Norway a certain seaman who saw things is dead. Might not the deeper inquiries of my uncle, after encountering the sculptor's data, have come to sinister ears after all. I think Professor Engel died because he knew too much, or because he was likely to learn too much. Whether I shall go, as he did, remains to be seen. I have learned much now, and I am afraid.